The winter of 2019 came to the hills of eastern Tennessee with a vengeance that no one had predicted, least of all Marcus Thompson, who sat alone in his small cabin on the outskirts of Ridgewood watching the snow pile against his windows like white walls slowly rising to imprison him. Marcus had seen plenty of harsh conditions in his 43 years on this earth, 20 of which had been spent serving his country in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. But there was something different about this storm. It felt personal, as if the sky itself had decided to bury him and everything he had left behind when he finally came home from his last deployment 3 years ago, with a purple heart, a titanium rod in his left leg, and a darkness in his mind that no metal could ever heal. He hadn't wanted the cabin. His sister Denise had practically forced him to take it after their father passed away 2 winters back, insisting that the quiet and the isolation would help him find himself again, as she put it, with that hopeful, heartbreaking look in her eyes that reminded him so much of their mother. Marcus had accepted the gift mostly to stop her worrying, to give her something to believe in, even though he knew in his heart that whatever piece of himself he had lost in that roadside explosion outside Kandahar wasn't something that could be found in the woods of Tennessee or anywhere else. Some things, once broken, stayed broken. That was a truth the war had taught him, written in the blood of friends whose faces still visited him in dreams, that left him gasping awake at 3 in the morning, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The cabin had belonged to his grandfather originally, built with his own hands back in the 1950s, when these hills were even more remote than they were now. It was solid construction, made to withstand whatever weather the mountains could throw at it. But as Marcus watched the snow continue to fall with no sign of stopping, he wondered if even Grandpa Thompson's craftsmanship had limits. The power had gone out 6 hours ago, and his cell phone had lost signal not long after. He had a generator, thank God, and enough firewood stacked on the covered porch to last a month if he was careful. He had food, water, and all the supplies a man needed to survive a siege. What he didn't have was any reason to care particularly much whether he survived or not. That was the thought he was turning over in his mind, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, when he heard the sound. It cut through the howling of the wind like a knife, high-pitched and desperate, unmistakably the sound of an animal in distress. Marcus sat up straighter, his combat instincts kicking in despite the years and the damage, his ears straining to locate the source. There it was again, fainter now, but still audible, coming from somewhere out in the white chaos beyond his windows. Something was out there, something was suffering, and something in Marcus, some part of him that the war hadn't managed to kill entirely, couldn't just sit there and let it happen. He moved before he could talk himself out of it, pulling on his heaviest coat and his insulated boots, grabbing the flashlight from beside the door and the walking stick that helped him navigate when his leg was acting up, which was most of the time in cold weather. The pain was already building as he stepped out onto the porch, the titanium rod conducting the cold straight into his bone, but he pushed through it the way he had pushed through 100 other pains in his life. Pain was just information. That's what his drill sergeant had told him a lifetime ago, and it was still true. You acknowledged it, you processed it, and you kept moving anyway. The snow was nearly knee-deep and still falling so thick that Marcus could barely see 10 feet in front of him. The wind cut through his coat like it wasn't even there, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his eyes water instantly. But he followed the sound, that pitiful crying that seemed to be coming from the old storage shed about 50 yards from his cabin, a structure that had been falling apart when his father was still alive and was now little more than a skeleton of rotting boards and rusted nails. Why anything would seek shelter there instead of in the forest, where the trees at least provided some protection from the wind, Marcus couldn't imagine. But animals didn't always make logical decisions. Neither did people, for that matter, as his own presence in this blizzard clearly demonstrated. He found her wedged into a corner of the collapsed shed, a dog so thin and ragged that his first thought was that she must be feral, some stray that had been living wild in these woods for who knew how long. She was medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, though it was hard to tell with all the matted fur and accumulated snow, with a coat that might have been golden once but was now so dirty and tangled that it looked almost gray. Her eyes, though, those eyes nearly broke him on the spot. They were brown, deep brown, and they held a mixture of fear and hope and desperate pleading that Marcus recognized all too well. He had seen that look in the eyes of civilians in war zones, in refugees fleeing violence they didn't understand, in children who had lost everything and were clinging to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone would help them. But it wasn't just the dog. As Marcus got closer, shining his flashlight into the darkness of the ruined shed, he saw them. 5 puppies, tiny things no more than a few weeks old, huddled against their mother's belly in a pathetic attempt to stay warm. They weren't moving much, and for a terrible moment, Marcus thought they might already be dead. Then one of them lifted its head, a small cream-colored face with closed eyes, and let out a weak cry that was barely audible over the wind. They were alive. Barely, but alive. And they wouldn't be for much longer if he didn't do something right now. The mother dog growled as he approached, a low, warning sound that was more desperation than aggression. She was trying to protect her babies, even though she was clearly exhausted and half-frozen herself, even though she probably knew she didn't have the strength to fight off a determined human. Marcus had seen that kind of courage before, too, the courage of those who had nothing left to lose except the ones they loved. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down, ignoring the screaming protest of his damaged leg, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. "Easy, girl," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm trying to help. I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but you've got to let me try. Those babies aren't going to make it out here, and neither are you. Please, let me help." The dog stared at him for a long moment, her brown eyes searching his face as if she could read his intentions in his expression. Marcus held perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for her to make a decision that would determine whether her family lived or died. The snow continued to fall around them, the wind continued to howl, and the temperature continued to drop. They didn't have time for a prolonged standoff. Every second that passed was a second closer to tragedy. Then, slowly, impossibly, the mother dog's growl faded. She lowered her head and looked at her puppies, then back at Marcus, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been surrender or might have been trust. She was giving him a chance. She was putting her children's lives in his hands because she had no other choice, because the alternative was watching them freeze to death in this miserable shed while she was powerless to save them. Marcus moved quickly but gently, stripping off his coat and using it to wrap up the puppies, creating a makeshift carrier that he could press against his chest. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his flannel shirt like teeth, but he ignored it. He had survived worse. He scooped up the bundle of puppies and turned to the mother dog, hoping she would follow him, praying that she had enough strength left to make it back to the cabin under her own power, because he couldn't carry her too, not with his leg and not in these conditions. "Come on, girl," he said, starting back the way he had come. "Stay with me. We're almost there." She followed. Stumbling, struggling, falling once and then twice in the deep snow, but always getting back up, always keeping her eyes fixed on the bundle in Marcus's arms that contained everything she had in this world. The journey back to the cabin took twice as long as the journey out, Marcus's leg threatening to give out with every step, the cold seeping into his bones and making his movements clumsy and slow. But they made it. They pushed through the door into the blessed warmth of the fire-heated cabin, and Marcus kicked the door shut behind them, blocking out the storm that had nearly claimed 6 innocent lives. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Marcus laid the puppies out on a blanket near the fire, checking each one for signs of frostbite or other damage, gently rubbing their tiny bodies to stimulate circulation. 3 of them seemed relatively okay, weak and cold but responsive, their little mouths opening and closing as they searched instinctively for their mother's milk. The other 2 were in worse shape, barely moving, their breathing so shallow that Marcus had to lean close to confirm they were still alive. He wrapped them in warm towels and held them against his own body, transferring what heat he could, talking to them in a low, steady voice, even though he knew they couldn't understand him. The mother dog watched all of this from a few feet away, too exhausted to move but refusing to take her eyes off her babies. Marcus had given her water and some of the canned chicken he kept in his pantry, and she had consumed both with a desperation that told him she hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer. Despite her obvious hunger and fatigue, though, she wouldn't settle down, wouldn't let herself rest until she was sure her puppies were safe. Marcus understood that. He had felt the same way about the men and women who had served under his command, the same fierce protectiveness that made rest impossible when your people were in danger. It was nearly midnight before the crisis passed. All 5 puppies were breathing normally now, huddled together in a nest of blankets that Marcus had arranged near the fire, their small bodies rising and falling in the rhythms of sleep. The mother dog had finally allowed herself to collapse beside them, one paw stretched out to touch her babies, her eyes closed but her ears still twitching at every sound. She didn't fully trust him yet, and Marcus didn't blame her. Trust was something that had to be earned, and he had only just begun. He sat in his grandfather's old armchair and watched them sleep, these 6 lives that had stumbled into his path on the worst night of the worst winter he could remember. He hadn't asked for this, he hadn't wanted it. All he had wanted was to be left alone with his darkness and his memories and his slowly fading hope that tomorrow might be better than today. But fate, or God, or whatever force governed the universe had other plans. It had sent him a mother and her children, beings who needed him in a way that no one had needed him since he came home from the war. And despite everything, despite the pain in his leg and the cold that had settled into his chest, and the voice in his head that whispered he wasn't worth saving, let alone capable of saving anyone else, Marcus felt something stir inside him, something that might have been purpose, something that might have been hope. The storm lasted 3 more days. 3 days of howling wind and relentless snow, 3 days of isolation, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the small sounds of the dog and her puppies as they slowly recovered from their ordeal. Marcus fell into a routine during those days, a rhythm of feeding and cleaning and caring that gave structure to hours that had previously stretched empty and meaningless. He made trips to the chicken coop his father had built, grateful that the hardy birds had survived the storm, and collected eggs that he scrambled for himself and cooked for the mother dog, who devoured them with increasing enthusiasm as her strength returned. He named her Hope. It wasn't a name he would have chosen normally, too sentimental for his taste, but it was the word that kept coming to mind when he looked at her, and eventually he stopped fighting it. Hope suited her. Despite everything she had been through, despite the starvation and the cold and the desperate struggle to keep her babies alive, there was something in her eyes that refused to give up. She had hoped that someone would come, had hoped that help would arrive, and against all odds, her hope had been rewarded. Marcus figured the least he could do was honor that. The puppies he named after soldiers he had known, men and women whose memories deserved to be kept alive. There was Jackson, the largest of the litter, a bold golden male who was always the first to explore and the last to settle down. There was Maria, a sweet-faced female with a patch of white on her chest, named for a medic who had saved Marcus's life in the minutes after the explosion that ended his military career. There was Chen, small and clever, with dark markings around his eyes that made him look perpetually thoughtful. There was Rodriguez, a cream-colored male who was the runt of the litter but made up for his size with fierce determination. And there was Davis, the puppy who had come closest to dying that first night, a female with golden fur just like her mother who was quieter and gentler than her siblings. Naming them was a mistake, Marcus knew. It meant he was getting attached, creating bonds that would make it harder to do the responsible thing and find them proper homes once the storm cleared. He was in no position to care for 6 dogs. His disability checks barely covered his own needs, and the cabin wasn't set up for animals, and he could barely take care of himself most days, let alone a mother dog and 5 growing puppies. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to take them to the shelter in Ridgewood as soon as the roads were clear and let someone else worry about their future. But every time he thought about doing that, he would look at Hope lying by the fire with her babies nestled against her, and the words would die in his throat. She trusted him now, fully, completely, in a way that she probably hadn't trusted any human in a long time, maybe ever. She would follow him from room to room, would lean against his leg when he sat down, would rest her head on his knee and look up at him with those brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. How could he repay that trust by abandoning her? How could he send her and her children off to an uncertain fate in an overcrowded shelter where they might be separated, might wait months for adoption, might never find the homes they deserved? He couldn't. He knew he couldn't, even as he told himself he should. These dogs had become his responsibility, his family. And Marcus Thompson was not a man who abandoned his family, no matter how difficult the circumstances. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Marcus woke to silence, the absence of wind so startling after days of constant howling that for a moment he thought something was wrong. He went to the window and saw a world transformed, everything covered in pristine white, the snow so deep in places that it reached halfway up tree trunks, the sky above a brilliant, almost painful blue. It was beautiful, the kind of scene that belonged on a Christmas card, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus felt something like peace as he looked at it. Hope came to stand beside him, her tail wagging slowly as she looked out at the snow-covered landscape. She was a different dog than the desperate creature he had pulled from the shed 4 nights ago. Regular food and warmth had done wonders for her, filling out her gaunt frame and bringing shine back to her matted coat, which Marcus had spent hours carefully brushing and detangling. She still had a long way to go, he knew, still bore the scars of whatever hard life she had lived before fate brought her to his doorstep, but she was going to make it. They both were. The puppies were thriving too, growing at a rate that amazed Marcus every time he looked at them. Their eyes had opened fully now, revealing 5 pairs of bright, curious gazes that tracked his every movement around the cabin. They were starting to walk, wobbly and uncoordinated, but determined, exploring their small world with the fearless enthusiasm of creatures who had never known cruelty or danger. Watching them play, watching them tumble over each other and chase after toys he improvised from old socks and bits of rope, Marcus felt something shifting inside him. The darkness that had been his constant companion for so long was still there, he knew, would probably always be there to some degree, but it wasn't alone anymore. There was light now too, small and fragile but growing stronger every day, and it had been kindled by a starving dog and her 5 half-frozen puppies. It took another 2 days for the roads to be cleared enough for travel. Marcus used that time to think, really think, about what he wanted to do and what was best for the animals who had come to depend on him. He made calls on his newly restored cell phone, talking to his sister Denise, who cried when she heard the story and immediately offered to help with costs. He talked to Dr. McCullough, Patricia Okonkwo, the only veterinarian in Ridgewood, who agreed to see Hope and the puppies as soon as Marcus could bring them in. He talked to the woman who ran the local animal shelter, a fierce advocate for homeless pets named Janet Morales, who told him honestly that she was overwhelmed with animals from the storm and couldn't guarantee quick adoption for a mother dog and her litter. That last conversation settled something in Marcus's mind. He wasn't going to the shelter. He wasn't sending Hope and her babies off to wait in cages for families that might never come. He was going to keep them, all of them, at least until he could find homes for the puppies himself. Homes where he could be sure they would be loved and cared for and never abandoned the way their mother had been. It was crazy, he knew. It was impractical and expensive and probably beyond his capabilities. But it was also right, and Marcus had learned long ago to trust his instincts about what was right. Dr. Okonkwo was a small woman with graying dreadlocks and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she fell in love with Hope at first sight. She examined the mother dog thoroughly, pronouncing her malnourished but otherwise healthy, probably around 3 years old, definitely a golden retriever mix of some kind. The puppies, she declared, to be in excellent condition considering their rough start in life, all 5 of them developing normally and showing no signs of lasting damage from their near-death experience in the snow. "You saved their lives, you know," Dr. Okonkwo said as she finished her examinations. "Another hour in that cold and we'd be having a very different conversation. Whatever made you go out in that blizzard? It was exactly the right thing to do." Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with praise, as he had always been. "I just heard a sound. Anyone would have done the same." The veterinarian looked at him with an expression that said she didn't believe that for a second. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, Mr. Thompson. I've seen a lot of people and a lot of animals, and I've learned that not everyone would do what you did. Some people hear a sound like that and tell themselves it's none of their business. Some people decide the risk isn't worth it. Some people don't have the courage or the compassion to act. You did. That says something about who you are." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and paid the bill, which was less than he expected, thanks to a discount Dr. Okonkwo insisted on giving him for being a veteran. He loaded Hope and the puppies back into his truck, which had taken some effort to dig out of the snow, but was running fine, and drove back to the cabin thinking about what the vet had said. It had been a long time since anyone had suggested that who he was might be something worth being. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of Marcus's life since coming home from Afghanistan. Caring for 6 dogs was exactly as challenging as he had expected, a constant cycle of feeding and cleaning and supervising and worrying that left him exhausted at the end of every day. The puppies grew at an astonishing rate, graduating from wobbly walking to enthusiastic running to creative mischief that kept Marcus on his toes from dawn to dusk. They chewed on everything they could reach, including several items Marcus would have sworn were out of reach. They had accidents on the floor despite his best efforts at house training. They barked and whined and demanded attention at the most inconvenient times possible. And Marcus loved every minute of it. For the first time since his discharge, he had a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose that demanded his attention and didn't leave room for the dark thoughts that had plagued him for so long. When Jackson needed to be taught not to jump on furniture, Marcus didn't have time to dwell on memories of combat. When Maria got into a tussle with Chin and needed to be separated, Marcus couldn't afford to sink into the depression that had been his constant companion. When Rodriguez escaped from the makeshift pen Marcus had built and had to be chased across the cabin, Marcus was too busy to contemplate the pointlessness of existence. The dogs didn't care about his trauma. They didn't know about his nightmares or his survivor's guilt or the scars that covered his body and soul. They just knew that he fed them and cared for them and loved them, and that was enough. Hope, meanwhile, became his shadow, his constant companion, his reason for taking the walks that Dr. Okonkwo insisted were good for his leg and his mental health. She seemed to sense when the darkness was creeping up on him, when the memories were threatening to overwhelm him, and she would press against his side or lay her head in his lap or simply sit beside him and remind him with her presence that he wasn't alone. She had her own scars, Marcus knew, her own trauma from whatever life she had lived before the blizzard. Sometimes she would wake from sleep with a start, trembling and disoriented, and Marcus would hold her and speak to her softly until she calmed down. They were healing each other, he realized, 2 broken creatures finding wholeness in their connection. His sister Denise came to visit in early February, driving up from Knoxville with a car full of dog supplies and a heart full of concern for her brother. She had been worried about him for years, Marcus knew, had watched helplessly as he withdrew from family and friends and sank deeper into isolation. What she found at the cabin astonished her. Instead of the hollowed-eyed recluse she had expected, she found a man who smiled when he greeted her, who laughed as puppies swarmed around her feet, who spoke with animation about training techniques and nutritional requirements and the personalities of each of his 6 dogs. "I don't know what to say," Denise said that evening, sitting by the fire with Hope's head resting on her knee while puppies played in the background. "You're different. You're better. I've been praying for something to bring you back to us, and I never imagined it would be a dog and her babies." Marcus shrugged, watching Davis attempt to climb over Chen, who was attempting to steal a toy from Rodriguez. "They needed me," he said simply. I guess maybe I needed them too. God works in mysterious ways, Denise said, and for once, Marcus didn't argue with her faith-based interpretation of events. Maybe she was right. Maybe something larger than chance had brought Hope and her puppies to that ruined shed on the worst night of the storm. Maybe there was a plan, a purpose, a meaning to the suffering that had defined so much of his life. Or maybe it was all just random, just the universe throwing lives together without reason or design. Either way, the result was the same. He had been saved, just as surely as he had saved the dogs. By March, the puppies were old enough to be weaned and ready for adoption. Marcus had been dreading this moment, knowing it was coming, but pushing it to the back of his mind, focusing on the present rather than the painful future. But he had made a promise to himself that he would find them good homes, homes where they would be loved and cherished for their entire lives, and he intended to keep that promise no matter how much it hurt. He started by putting up flyers around Ridgewood and posting on social media, with help from Denise, who understood the internet far better than he did. The response was overwhelming. It seemed like everyone who had heard the story of the Blizzard rescue wanted one of those miracle puppies, and Marcus found himself fielding dozens of calls and emails from potential adopters. He was selective, maybe too selective, interviewing each applicant extensively and even making home visits to ensure that the environment would be suitable. Some people thought he was crazy, going to so much trouble for dogs that most would have sent to the shelter without a second thought. But most understood, or at least respected, his dedication to getting it right. Jackson was the first to go, adopted by a young couple named the Martinezes, who had just bought a house with a big backyard and were eager to fill it with a dog. Marcus watched them play with the puppy during the home visit, saw the way they looked at him with pure adoration, and knew in his heart that it was right. He handed over the leash with tears in his eyes that he didn't bother to hide, making the Martinezes promise to send updates and photos and to call him immediately if there were ever any problems. Chen went to a retired teacher named Eleanor Blackwood, a woman in her 70s who had lost her previous dog to old age 6 months earlier and hadn't thought she was ready for another until she met the clever, thoughtful puppy who seemed to understand her loneliness without being told. Rodriguez was adopted by a family with 3 children, the perfect high-energy environment for a puppy who never seemed to stop moving. Davis, the gentle one, found a home with a hospice nurse named Raymond who worked long hours and wanted a calm companion to come home to. Each goodbye was harder than the last. Marcus would watch the puppies drive away with their new families, knowing he would probably never see them again, feeling like pieces of his heart were being torn away and scattered across Tennessee. But he also felt a fierce pride in what he had accomplished, in the lives he had set on paths toward happiness and love. These dogs would never know the suffering their mother had endured. They would never be abandoned in a storm to freeze and die. They would grow old, surrounded by people who cherished them, and that was worth any amount of personal pain. Maria was the last to be adopted, and her departure nearly broke Marcus entirely. She had always been special to him, not just because of the name, but because of her personality, a sweetness and sensitivity that reminded him so much of the human Maria who had saved his life. The family who adopted her was perfect, a single mother named Grace and her 10-year-old daughter Sophie, who had been asking for a dog for years and fell instantly in love with the puppy, who seemed to return their affection tenfold. Marcus knew it was right. He knew Maria would be happy, but as he watched their car disappear down the road, he sank to his knees in the snow and wept in a way he hadn't allowed himself to weep since he came home from the war. Hope found him there, her warm body pressing against his, her tongue licking the tears from his face. She understood. She had said goodbye to her babies too, had watched each one leave with the quiet dignity of a mother who knows her children have grown beyond her. But she wasn't broken by it. She wasn't destroyed. She was still here, still present, still ready to face whatever came next with the resilience that had defined her since the first night Marcus saw her in that ruined shed. "It's just us now, girl," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around her. "Just you and me. Is that okay?" Hope's tail wagged, and she licked his face again, and Marcus knew that her answer was yes. More than yes, it was everything. Spring came to the Tennessee hills with a gentleness that seemed designed to heal the wounds the winter had inflicted. The snow melted, the trees budded, the world transformed from white to green in a slow miracle that Marcus found himself appreciating in a way he never had before. He and Hope walked the forest trails every day, exploring the wilderness around the cabin, building strength in his leg and peace in his mind with every step. He started a garden, something his father had always done and he had always sworn he would never bother with, planting vegetables and herbs that Hope would supervise with keen interest. He called his sister more often, reconnected with old army buddies, even started seeing a therapist in Ridgewood who specialized in treating veterans with PTSD. The darkness wasn't gone. It would probably never be completely gone, he understood now. But it was manageable. It was survivable. It was no longer the defining fact of his existence, but rather one element among many, balanced by purpose and connection and, yes, hope. The dog had given him back his life, or at least shown him that he still had a life worth living. He could never repay her for that gift. He could only try to be worthy of it. The former puppy owners sent updates regularly, photos and videos of their dogs growing and thriving, and Marcus treasured each one like the precious gifts they were. Jackson had learned to catch a frisbee. Chen had figured out how to open cabinets and was getting into everything. Rodriguez had become inseparable from the youngest of the 3 children in his family, a 5-year-old named Michael, who called him "my best friend" with complete sincerity. Davis was earning certification as a therapy dog, accompanying Raymond to the hospice where he worked and bringing comfort to people in their final days. Maria had started agility training with Sophie, who had dreams of competing someday. These updates always made Marcus smile, sometimes through tears, and he would share them with Hope as if she could understand. Maybe she could, in her own way. She would look at the photos on his phone with interest, her tail wagging, and Marcus liked to think she recognized her babies even as they grew into dogs she barely resembled. They were out there, living good lives, spreading the love and joy that she had somehow managed to preserve, even through starvation and freezing cold and abandonment. Her legacy was growing, touching more lives every day, creating ripples that extended far beyond what any of them could see. Summer brought visitors to the cabin. Denise came with her husband and their 2 teenage sons, who were initially skeptical about spending a week in the middle of nowhere, but quickly became devoted to Hope, taking her on hikes and throwing balls for her until she was happily exhausted. Dr. Okonkwo stopped by on her way to a veterinary conference in Nashville, checking on Hope's continued health and sharing stories about other rescues she had seen in her long career. Janet Morales from the shelter come too, bringing a photographer who wanted to do a feature on the blizzard rescue story for a regional magazine. The article came out in September, and it was more than Marcus had expected or wanted. They had used his military photo alongside recent pictures of him and Hope, had told the whole story of the rescue and its aftermath, had quoted him saying things about healing and purpose that he wasn't sure he had meant to say out loud. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People reached out from across the country, veterans and non-veterans alike, telling him their own stories of struggling and surviving, of finding hope in unexpected places. Some wanted advice. Some just wanted to tell someone who would understand. Marcus tried to answer every message, tried to offer what comfort and encouragement he could, even though he still didn't feel qualified to help anyone. One message stood out from the rest. It came from a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who lived in a town called Sawyer, about 50 miles from Ridgewood. She had read the article with tears streaming down her face, she said, because she recognized Hope from the photo. Her name hadn't always been Hope. Before she was abandoned, before she ended up pregnant and starving in a blizzard, she had been called Bella, and she had belonged to Patricia's elderly neighbor, a man named Arthur Connolly, who had died suddenly of a heart attack the previous year. Marcus read the message 3 times before he could process what it meant. Hope, his Hope, had once had a home. She had once been loved, or at least owned, by someone who had given her a different name. And when that person died, she had ended up. Where? On the streets? In a shelter? Abandoned by whoever inherited Arthur Connolly's estate? Patricia didn't know the details, only that Bella had disappeared after Arthur's death, and that no one had been able to find her, despite efforts from several neighbors who had been fond of the gentle golden dog. He drove to Sawyer on a Saturday morning, Hope riding beside him the way she always did, and met Patricia at a coffee shop downtown. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile, and she started crying the moment she saw Hope walk through the door. "Oh my God," she said, kneeling down to the dog's level. "Bella, it's really you! I can't believe it! We thought you were dead!" Hope's tail wagged uncertainly, and she sniffed Patricia's outstretched hand with polite curiosity. She clearly recognized the woman on some level, responding to the familiar scent or voice, but there was no dramatic reunion, no overwhelming display of remembered affection. Whatever Hope remembered of her old life, she had moved on. She was Marcus's dog now, and nothing was going to change that. Patricia seemed to understand. She told Marcus everything she knew about Arthur Connolly, a widower in his 80s who had adopted Bella from a shelter 5 years earlier and loved her with every fiber of his being. When Arthur died, his son had come from out of state to handle the estate, and the son had made it clear that he didn't want anything to do with his father's dog. Patricia had offered to take Bella, as had several other neighbors, but the son had insisted on dealing with it himself. He claimed he would find her a good home, but based on what happened next, Patricia suspected he had simply dumped her somewhere and driven away. "I felt guilty about it ever since," Patricia said, wiping her eyes. "I should have fought harder. I should have insisted. Arthur loved that dog more than anything, and his good-for-nothing son just threw her away like garbage. If I had known." "You couldn't have known," Marcus said. "None of us can predict what other people will do. The important thing is that she survived. She found her way to me, and I found her, and now she's safe. That's what matters." Patricia nodded, reaching out to stroke Hope's head one last time. "Arthur would have been grateful to you," she said. "He would have been so happy to know that Bella found someone who loves her the way you clearly do. Take care of her, Mr. Thompson. She deserves it." "I will," Marcus promised. "I will for as long as I live." The first anniversary of the blizzard rescue came on a December night that was cold but clear, the stars visible in a way they rarely were, the moon bright enough to cast shadows on the snow-covered ground. Marcus built a fire in the fireplace and sat in his grandfather's armchair with Hope curled at his feet, thinking about everything that had happened in the year since he had heard that desperate cry from the ruined shed. He thought about the puppies, all 5 of them thriving in their new homes. He thought about Patricia Hendricks and Arthur Connolly and the journey that had brought Hope from a comfortable home to abandonment, to the brink of death, and finally to this cabin where she had found a new life. He thought about himself, about the man he had been a year ago and the man he had become, and he marveled at the difference. He was still broken in some ways. The rod in his leg still ached in cold weather. The nightmares still came, though less frequently than before. The memories of friends lost and horrors witnessed still lurked in the corners of his mind, ready to emerge when he least expected them. But he was no longer drowning in his brokenness. He was swimming, treading water, making progress toward a shore he had once believed didn't exist. And it was all because of a dog who had needed him and allowed him to need her in return. "Thank you," he said to Hope, who lifted her head at the sound of his voice. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for giving me something to live for. I don't know where I'd be without you, girl. I don't know if I'd be anywhere at all." Hope's tail thumped against the floor, and she gave him that look that always seemed to see straight through to his soul. She understood. She always understood. Whatever mysterious bond existed between humans and dogs, she embodied it completely, offering a love that was unconditional and a loyalty that was absolute. She had been through her own hell, had suffered and struggled and nearly died, and yet she had never lost her capacity to trust, to love, to hope. If she could do it, Marcus thought, then maybe he could too. The months that followed brought new challenges and new joys. Marcus started volunteering at Janet Morales' shelter. using his experience with Hope and the puppies to help socialize difficult dogs and prepare them for adoption. He found he had a gift for it, an ability to connect with animals that others had given up on, to see past their fear and aggression to the loving creatures underneath. Janet started calling him her secret weapon, and the shelter's adoption rates improved noticeably after he joined the team. He also started speaking publicly about his experiences, first at a local veterans group and then at larger events as word spread about his story. He talked about the war and its aftermath, about the darkness that had nearly consumed him, about the unexpected rescue that had come in the form of a starving dog and her freezing puppies. He talked about the importance of mental health support for veterans, about the healing power of animals, about the need to never give up hope, even when hope seemed impossible. It wasn't easy, baring his soul to strangers, but Marcus found that every time he told his story, the weight of it became a little lighter. And if his words helped even one person find their way back from the edge, it was worth every moment of discomfort. The second anniversary of the rescue brought a surprise that Marcus never could have anticipated. He received a letter from the daughter of Raymond, the hospice nurse who had adopted Davis. Raymond had passed away suddenly, she wrote, just 3 months earlier. It had been his heart, a condition no one knew about until it was too late. But in his final weeks, as he dealt with the diagnosis and prepared for the end, Davis had been his constant companion, never leaving his side, providing comfort and love in a way that had made the unbearable bearable. Raymond had asked his daughter to make sure Marcus knew how much Davis had meant to him, how the gentle puppy had grown into a gentle dog who had been with him through the hardest journey of his life. Marcus wept when he read that letter, holding Hope close and thinking about the strange circles that life inscribed. Davis had been named for a soldier who died in combat, a young man who had never gotten to grow old or say goodbye to his loved ones. And now, Davis the dog had helped a dying man face his end with peace and dignity. It was too much to be coincidence, Marcus thought. It had to mean something, even if he couldn't quite understand what. The letter also included an invitation. Raymond's daughter wanted Marcus to have Davis back if he was willing to take her. She wasn't in a position to care for a dog, she explained, and Raymond had specifically asked that Davis go to Marcus if anything ever happened to him. He said you would understand her, she wrote. He said you were the only one who could truly appreciate what she was. Marcus drove to Raymond's daughter's house the following weekend, Hope riding beside him as always. When he walked in the door, Davis recognized him immediately, her tail wagging with an excitement that seemed to transcend the 2 years since they had last seen each other. She ran to him and pressed against his legs, looking up at him with eyes that were so like Hope's that it took his breath away. And Hope, rather than showing any jealousy or territorial behavior, simply walked over and touched noses with her daughter, accepting her return as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The three of them drove home together, 2 generations of dogs who had survived the same blizzard, now reunited in the care of the man who had saved them both. Marcus looked at them in his rearview mirror, Hope and Davis curled together on the back seat, and felt a completeness that he had never expected to find. His family had grown again, not through rescue this time, but through the strange workings of fate that kept bringing these creatures into his life. He didn't understand it. He wasn't sure he needed to. All he knew was that he was grateful, more grateful than words could ever express. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and gifts. Hope aged gracefully, her muzzle turning white and her steps slowing, but her spirit remaining as bright as ever. Davis grew into a beautiful adult dog, calmer than her mother, but with the same gentle soul, the same ability to sense emotions and respond with exactly the right kind of comfort. Marcus aged too, his hair going gray and his leg bothering him more than ever, but he found that he minded less than he once had. There was too much good in his life now to waste time dwelling on the bad. He kept in touch with the other puppy adopters, watching from afar as Jackson and Maria and Shen and Rodriguez lived their full, happy lives. He celebrated their birthdays and mourned when, one by one, they crossed the rainbow bridge in the fullness of their years. Each death was a grief, a reminder of the inexorable passage of time, but also a celebration of lives well lived and love freely given. Marcus had saved them on that blizzard night so long ago, and in return, they had given him a reason to keep going when he had all but given up. Hope died on a spring morning, peacefully and without pain, in the same cabin where Marcus had nursed her back to health so many years before. She was lying by the fire, her head resting on her paws, Davis curled beside her the way she had once curled with her siblings. Marcus was there, holding her paw, telling her how much she meant to him, promising her that he would be okay when she was gone. He didn't know if she understood his words, but he believed she understood his love, the same love she had given him so freely from the moment she decided to trust him. He buried her on the hill behind the cabin, in a spot that overlooked the forest where they had walked together countless times. The grave was marked with a simple stone that read, "Hope. She saved my life. 2016-2031. It wasn't much of an epitaph for a dog who had meant so much, but Marcus knew that the true memorial to Hope wasn't the stone or the words carved into it. It was the life she had given him back, the purpose she had restored, the hope that she had embodied and shared and left behind even after she was gone. Davis stayed by Marcus's side through the grief, just as Hope had stayed by his side through so many other darknesses. She was older herself now, her own muzzle starting to show hints of white, but she had years left in her, years of companionship and love that would carry Marcus through whatever remained of his own journey. They walked the forest trails together, sat by the fire together, faced each day together with the understanding that came from shared history and unconditional devotion. Marcus still volunteered at the shelter, still spoke about his experiences to anyone who would listen, still tried to honor Hope's memory by helping other animals and other people find their way to healing. He had become something of a local legend, the veteran who had been saved by a dog and spent the rest of his life paying it forward. People came to him with their broken animals and their broken hearts, and he did what he could to help them find the light that he himself had once been so sure didn't exist. On the 10th anniversary of the blizzard rescue, Marcus held a small gathering at his cabin. His sister Denise was there, and Dr. Okonkwo, and Janet Morales, and half a dozen other people who had been part of the story over the years. The surviving puppy adopters came too, sharing photos and memories of dogs who were mostly gone now but still loved, still remembered. They toasted to Hope and her puppies, to the storm that had brought them together, to the strange and beautiful ways that life could surprise you when you least expected it. "You know what I've learned in all these years?" Marcus said, standing by the flyer with Davis at his feet and his friends gathered around. "I've learned that we never know where salvation is going to come from. Sometimes it comes from the places we least expect. Sometimes it comes from the beings we're supposed to save, who end up saving us instead. I thought I was rescuing a dog and her puppies that night. I didn't know they were rescuing me, but they were. Hope rescued me from myself, from my darkness, from a life that had lost all meaning, and I will spend whatever days I have left being grateful for that gift." There were tears in the room, including his own, but they were good tears, the kind that came from acknowledging how much love existed in the world, even amid all the pain and loss. Marcus looked at the faces of his friends, thought about Hope and her puppies and all the lives they had touched, and felt something that might have been peace settle into his heart. He was still broken. He would always be broken in some ways. But he was also whole, held together by bonds of love that had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances and grown stronger with every passing year. That night, after everyone had gone home, Marcus sat in his grandfather's armchair with Davis sleeping at his feet. The fire crackled softly, the stars shone through the windows, and the cabin was quiet in a way that had once felt like loneliness, but now felt like serenity. He thought about Hope, imagining her running free somewhere beyond the veil, her puppies beside her, all of them young and healthy and whole. He thought about the soldiers he had lost, the friends who had died too young, wondering if maybe they were up there too, throwing balls for ghostly dogs in fields of endless green. He thought about his own death, which was closer now than it had ever been, and found that he wasn't afraid. When his time came, he would be ready. He would go knowing that he had made a difference, that he had been loved and had loved in return, that his life had meant something, even when he had been sure it didn't. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to hope, to whatever forces of chance or destiny had conspired to put a freezing dog and her puppies in his path on the worst night of the worst winter in memory. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for showing me that there was still something worth living for. Thank you for everything." Davis stirred in her sleep, her tail thumping once against the floor as if in response. Marcus smiled and closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the peace of the moment wash over him. Outside, the wind blew gently through the trees, carrying with it the promise of spring and the endless cycle of life and death and renewal that governed all things. Inside, a man and his dog slept the sleep of the content, two souls who had found each other against all odds and would remain together until the very end. The story of the veteran who saved a freezing dog and her puppies in a snowstorm continued to spread, shared in articles and social media posts and conversations around kitchen tables. People were moved by it, inspired by it, changed in ways both large and small. Some adopted animals from shelters, some reached out to veterans in their communities. Some simply resolved to be a little kinder, a little more willing to help those in need, a little more open to the possibility that love could come from unexpected places. The ripples extended outward, touching lives that Marcus would never know, creating connections that would outlast him by generations. That was Hope's true legacy. Not the puppies she had born and Marcus had saved, as wonderful as they were. Not the awards and recognition that had come to Marcus for his rescue, as meaningful as those might be. Her legacy was the demonstration that even in the darkest storm, even when all seems lost, there is still the possibility of redemption. There is still the chance that someone will hear your cry and come to help. There is still, always, hope. And that hope, kindled on a frozen night in a ruined shed, continued to burn brightly in the hearts of all who heard the story and believed.